And I've been given the fortunate task of summarizing the day in like 7 minutes precisely. So I'm thinking about which part of the 7 minutes should I talk about. And because there was such a lot of good content throughout the day, so I was trying to step back and think through what really, transpired here. And it helped a little bit that I'm a little bit jet lagged, so I got some unique insights because of that. But one of the frameworks that I typically use, and I've used it in the past, is this concept of what I call vision, alignment, and execution. And these are the 3 pillars of how you think about any situation. So I started to think about, so what did we talk about when we talked about the vision of GRC as a team, as a group here? So I took some notes and just wanted to share some of my thoughts on that. When you start to think about the vision, I feel what, Gaurav kicked it off by discussing, the volatility and the challenges in the world and so forth and how we need to stay calm. But the concept of being connected GRC kind of came across throughout the day. The notion of continuous GRC, especially what was energizing was when Prasad and Joy and Raghu talked about the whole concept of the cloud, the new cloud, which is the no-code, the cloud, which is where you can actually create programmable applications for GRC without writing any single code. That, to me, was one of the key themes coming out of it. So this whole notion of connected, continuous, and cloud kind of becomes the future of the vision of how GRC kind of grows as I see it. The other key theme that emerged very clearly was ESG, where ESG equals to integrity. Mike Rasmussen said that in one of the panels, but ESG is also equal to GRC. I heard that phrase. And how you balance profit and purpose in a real way, that to me, at some point back in the past, was futuristic, and now it's a reality. If you think about what transpired over the last 3 years with the COVID and so forth, ESG has become real. We also talked about, as we thought about the vision, about how it is important for risk professionals to actually scan things in the horizon, not just be dug our head in the sand and look at day to day. We've got to start looking at scanning the horizon. I think Jacob from Nordea, he talked about this whole idea of horizon scanning is key. So I just want us to take away that as visionaries and the risk professionals, you have to be scanning the horizon. Mike Rasmussen called it right brain, left brain. But without horizon scanning, we can get lost into the details. I also heard about the concept of micro-learnings. So to be great visionary in this space, you've got to learn in small little steps. And I think that conversation came out. And I love particularly the comment I heard from Joe Martinez from Aon around better data for better decisions. And I think, to me, data is the new oil. That's where the game is, and that's where risk can be synthesized from in the right way. What you can't manage, what you don't know, you can't secure. So the whole concept of what you don't manage well, you really cannot do that without real data. And if you don't manage something, you cannot secure that. So this was a comment, again, coming around the whole idea of data is critical. And ultimately, when you look at the vision of where we are all going, it is the digital future in a world which is laced with a lot of geopolitical uncertainties, supply chain uncertainties, and so forth. So when I looked at the last several hours today, we talked about the vision of GRC. The second part of it is what I call alignment. So how do you align as an organization, as an ecosystem? So the first theme that I heard was break the silos. Across the board, a lot of comments around breaking the silos. Aligning risk and growth was another theme that emerged. It's not just about aligning between risk and compliance or between all the actors in the profession of GRC, but how do you align risk and growth, based on actual data, ethical data. So that was the concept that came up. I remember Judith, for example, from S&P, she talked about the merger of risk and compliance. Something nice happened when you actually collapsed the boundaries between the two organizations, which is unheard of because we traditionally think about first line, second line, third line. What does it do if you collapse the boundaries? Is that a good thing? Is that not a good thing? So we talked about risk managers being taken seriously by the risk takers. That's part of the alignment process. And aligning risk to strategy and performance and objective was another theme that people touched upon. So when I think about vision, we then moved into the alignment. And last but not least, probably that's where the rubber hits the road, is execution. And execution has to be informed with real quantifiable data. One of the comments Sarah mentioned from Nationwide, and I remember meeting her 3 years back, pre-COVID, when we were at the last GRC Summit. She was just about getting off with her implementation at Nationwide, and she said 80% of the success is attributable to business alignment on the business side. Yes, technology is important, 20% was technology, but having the right set of business frameworks in place to be able to make the implementation successful was critical. And we also heard that people and process are key. It's not just about technology. This is not to say metrics team has the greatest products, but we cannot have successful execution or implementation without the right people, process, and frameworks in place at the business level. So that's where I would urge, and people talked about leveraging partners is going to be a key. So for example, the conversation about Cube and how it brings regulatory intelligence into the mix was important. So as I look at the summary of the day, I would say no code, that's the future. Continuous and cognitive AI-based GRC is the future. And the balance of quantitative and qualitative is the future, both. Right brain, left brain. And as we pull that together, that's where you create an agile organization which can drive growth in a volatile world. So we want risk that drives growth. And that's where the promised land lives with all of us. So that's my summary for the day with all of what I heard from you. None of these are my statements. These are actually synthesis. All I did was put them into 3 buckets of vision, alignment, and execution. And when we do these 3 things correctly, thoughtfully, every step of the GRC way, where we have the right vision, a shared vision, a real alignment. And alignment is a strategic tool. It does not mean that it eliminates debate or oversight or even conflicts. But alignment is an important word for all of us to understand. And then when we get into execution after that, that's the magic of GRC. So I'll leave that with that. But without much further ado, I would like to now just give a brief introduction to Juan. So it was good that you were busy in the day for a few hours to come in from Madrid into London. But hopefully the summary gave you a little bit of color for what happened. So it's nice to see you here.
Thank you, Ungan, for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah. But just to give a little introduction about Juan, he has been very familiar to the metrics team community. He currently serves as the head of internal audit of Santander Group. He lives in Madrid. He has worked within Santander since 1999, also having served as head of the corporate risk division, head of recovery and resolutions plans project, and head of corporate legal department, and head of corporate finance unit. He received his law degree from Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, 1982, and became state attorney in 1984. He served in Spanish administration and as deputy director of the Spanish Treasury Department as well. He's member of the Santander Holdings USA, Inc., Santander Bank US, and Santander International Miami boards. He's been a director of Santander Asset Management, SGIC, Santander Pensioners, and number of other organizations within Santander family. So welcome to the panel here.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to have a few questions. So I have the easier job of asking the questions, and I'll let you share your thoughts with the audience here.
Okay.
So one of the things that Gaurav in his early keynote talked about was about overcoming fear and reimagining what's possible as we manage risk and foster growth. Given the realities of the tumultuous world in which we live today, how would you reimagine risk, in this current climate?
Well, clearly we are living now, let's say, at least volatile if not difficult situation, taking into account different aspects and different crises that are happening one after the other, no? But I guess that at least there are two elements that make us a little bit easier to cope with these situations, not only singular but plural. First is that precisely because we have to encounter crisis situation, we focus. In the past, we were considering any type of risks. I even remember maybe 3 years ago talking about the risk coming for the summer storms that may have electronic waves on the earth, which is a very intellectual exercise, but not very practical. And now we have to focus in what is really relevant. Just to take the sample of inflation, well, we have forgotten about inflation. And now we are still back to everything that has something to do with inflation and the effects of inflation. So we are concentrating on the real, important, actual risks that we have to manage. And then the other aspect is that, in my view, not out of the very recent crisis, but out of some others in the past years, we have also managed to organize and put in place systems, data, methodologies that give us real opportunity of managing risk in a different way. And that has happened in our industry with the financial crisis, and a lot of new instruments have been put in place from capital control systems to the recovery plans that are very important for the financial industry, to many others that we can now really use in practice because we have understand how do they work and we have put them in place. And finally, we have the very recent experience of the COVID crisis that nobody could have imagined and that came all of a sudden. And we were able to cope with it. So it's not only about methodologies and systems and instruments, it's also about the confidence that it has already happened, something that was not imaginable for everybody, and we have been able to cope with it. So at least we have the experience that in that specific case, well, we did it.
Thank you, Juan. So as I heard you answer the question there, right, one of the thoughts that I would like you to share is, in this world, like, how do you think about creating a healthy partner ecosystem, especially, as you look at it from a banking and financial services or even broadly, a healthy partner ecosystem, which helps you deal with some of the volatilities and the supply chain shortages and rising inflation and so forth that's going on. How should companies think about it, in a world where they have to also think about third party, fourth party, other risks factors? So can you share some thoughts on the partner side of the equation?
Well, I guess that in the one hand, as you said, having the possibility of partner with other institutions or big companies or not so big companies that help you to develop some processes in a more efficient and inexpensive way is very relevant in present times. But in the other hand, by doing that, you are adding operational and in many cases technological risk to your systems. And clearly the way you connect with those other entities, in many cases through technology, in many cases through cloud, and in many cases by them providing services to you that are supported by some other's cloud, that generates a huge amount of additional operational and technological risk. So how do you cope with that? How do you control or audit, if possible, the big providers of cloud services? And how do you manage to control the risk coming out for somebody rendering service to you that are supported in a system of software as a service, but a third-party cloud provider, is really very challenging. So the two elements of the equation that you have mentioned, efficiency by putting those systems together, but risk by putting those connections together, are to be managed. And I clearly have not a magic formula for that. What I really think is important is to at least have a very clear idea of all the providers you are connected with and a clear idea of how the processes incorporate those providers in your whole network of operations. And having that clear idea and being able to analyze and control it is really a very relevant challenge in the next future.
Thank you, Juan. So you said operational excellence. So in your world at Banco Santander, what does operational resilience really mean? Because it means different things to different people. So can you help us just give your definition of operational resilience as you see from your vantage point?
Well, probably, and this is heavily biased by the fact that we, as GCFI, Global Relevant Institution, have to develop the so-called recovery and resolution plans to be managed by us and by the supervisors. That has not imposed, but at least influenced our concept of resilience. Because at the end of the day, operational resilience means the capacity of surviving, even in the one hand, the day-to-day deterioration, you get rusty by the day-to-day activity, or a relevant catastrophe or crisis, or what you want to call them. So by preparing the recovery and resolution plans and executing the so-called war games on what happens if you are in this specific situation, you get to the conclusion of whether or not you are resilient. You are able of keep your activity even in those circumstances. But again, coming back to my previous comment, we have had a very real world case with the COVID situation. From one day to the other, we had to be able to keep our people connected remotely and our systems working in a totally different situation with a lot of operational and risk challenges. And we, when I say we say all we were able to do so.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. So one question that, and I think someone mentioned, one of the comments was that they get, it's really worrisome when people don't worry about, unknown risks and so forth. So when you look at the world, there's a lot of conversations around cyber risk, and that's top of mind for risk leaders globally. But is there anything hiding under the surface that leaders should be monitoring and planning for in the future that, is kind of hitting your radar at least?
Well, the problem about unknown is it's unknown, and as a consequence, you don't know about it, and even can be not unknown, but unthoughtable. You cannot think about it. But if I have to identify one of them on top of cyber, that in my view still is and will be a very relevant one, that, you can try to manage, but is the never-ending story. I guess that in today's world there is another element that has to do with talent, human resources, and management of people. And even before management of people, recruiting people, keeping people, training people, and having people as a part of the organization. Because what we have learned through the COVID crisis about remote working and the consequences out of that in the post-COVID world, it might be different in one country to the other, but is similar in many aspects, is creating clearly a new situation. And the way you train people, the way you manage people, or the way you control risk of people working remote, vis-a-vis working physically all together in a single space, is very different. And I guess it's totally a different dimension from cyber, but I guess that this is a kind of a new risk that we don't even understand today, but that we have to be very focused on it in the future.
No, that's very well said. One of the topics that came up earlier in the day, that risk is all interconnected, right? So whether you're looking at talent risk or cyber risk and so forth, so how do you connect the dots and continue, at Santander with the regulatory changes and so forth, in a complex ecosystem of different business units and global footprint? What, from your vantage point, do you do to connect the dots between these seemingly disparate regulators and supervisors and regulatory changes happening around the world?
Well, that's very true. And in some aspects, including the ESG you have mentioned about before, and within the ESG, the S and everything that has to do with climate change, as you all know, we're having a relevant problem because we as financial institutions are being demanded to first gather and present information under standards and definitions that didn't exist in the past, but we have to gather data from the past with the standards and definitions that didn't exist. And second, we have more or less to police our clients because we have to demand from our clients to comply with those specific standards that are not still clearly established by the supervisors, but we are asked to demand from them those data and ask from them responsibility. This is only an example, but coming back to your question of how to manage all risks that are extended, that are different, and that under the very demanding supervisor activity of supervisors, I think that in the history we have been managing different types of risk. In our field, financial institutions, credit risk was the very first one, and was not only a risk incidental to our activity, it's the core of our activity. We make money by managing credit risk. Then we have market risk. Then we began to have operational risk. Then we had some aspects of operational risk that are very specific, anti-money laundering or fraud. Then we have technology and cyber. Then we have these new risks. And what we have learned is that when we begin touching base with new risks, we have to learn, and we have to understand it, and we have to conceptualize it, and to prepare methodologies appropriate to that kind of risk. And then we began to get to standards that are similar to the ones we already have for the very first one, that was credit risk. So the only way to cope with it is trying to organize how do you understand and manage each type of risk to get to a level that is at least enough at the moment in time, and then go to the next one. But clearly, if you had a good standard for the previous one, it seems possible to take care of the new ones. If you are not in that situation, it's really very difficult.
No, I can totally see that. So what you've handled thus far gives you the ability to handle the new changes in the regulations and so forth. So one question here, and after this I'll open it up for the audience for any questions, but what advice can you share about balancing and prioritizing the demands of your profession? I mean, you've been in this seat for a long time, and you worry about worrying, you think about risk, you think about data, you think about all of these. So how do you stay optimistic and positive, when that's your day job? So can you give advice as a GRC risk professional and as an executive who's lived this for the last 20 plus years?
You assume that I keep optimistic. But let's say that that's the case. And probably it has also to do with past experience, because we have been involved in relevant crises, and again, I use we, as we all have been able to cope with them. And on the other hand, and this is quite a very intuitive, very general concept, well, I think that we are clearly better off than the people that take care of this question before us 30 years ago, or 60 years ago, or 100 years ago. And of course, in the middle, there have been very relevant crises, wars, problems, whatever. And it seems that the evolution is still for the best, not for the worst, even though we have, situations that are not as positive from time to time. And on the other hand, the basic idea of problematic situations being as well opportunities, I still think is a true statement. So those two ideas of problems equals opportunity, and in the past we have been able to manage problems, and situation, generally speaking, evolves to the better instead to the worse, are two good tools to afford these situations, I guess.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Juan. So any questions from the audience here? No? All right. Looks like it's in the end of the day. So I would say that, just if there's a couple of takeaways here as we conclude the day today, and I'm sure we have a full packed agenda tomorrow. I know Prasad is waiting to get on the stage here tomorrow to kind of give his keynote on the product side and so forth, and many other exciting panels tomorrow. But I would say what Juan just said is something that has been on my mind as well. This whole concept of talent risk, the world has changed. The world actually has changed, and we may or may not really quite understand. Yes, we are talking about GRC, we are talking about, the ESG part, the cyber, the business, and other kinds of risk. But as you leave the room today, think about talent. And today, it may or may not be in the centerfold of what you do, but given that we all get paid to worry, let's worrying about talent as to what it means in this new world. How should you think about the culture? What role does GRC does in setting, kind of establishing the risks around the culture? How does it work in the remote world? What does it mean when there's debate going on and you saw, what's happening at Twitter, Elon Musk forcing people to come to work and sleep at the office as on one extreme, and then there are other extremes where nobody shows up to work, even if the CEO asks you to come to the work. Where is the right equilibrium? What's the right balance? And how should, as risk professionals, we should think about it? Because if talent is what drives productivity, that's what drives growth, and that's what drives the business, how does it work for the GRC professionals? I would like you guys to reflect and think about this. I don't have the answer. I don't think, Juan, I'm sure this is a question on your mind as you're looking at the scale. But I think it's respectfully for all of us, this is a question that we should be thinking about how to better manage talent risk in our respective organizations.
Check.
So as we leave today, there's a question? Okay. As we step out today, we should think about how do we continue to establish shared vision within our organizations and within this community that we have. How do we think about alignment as a strategy? How do you align across the risk takers and people who are in the business of risk oversight? And how do you execute? If we can start to think about that, layering in the talent risk into the equation, that's when GRC becomes more pervasive and more integrated and more connected. So anyway, so there's one final question, I guess.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question, Juan. So we watched you. I'm Gaurav from MetricStream. We watched you over the last 7-8 years. You've been a chief audit executive, but we see you also as a chief innovation officer at Santander. We've seen you go beyond your audit duties and discuss what the next bank should look like. I still remember a discussion on how the next retail, what will happen in retail. How do you, for this audience, give us a little bit of color personally, how you're able to separate your audit duties and actually focus on innovation and bring strategy to the table as a chief auditor. Typically, audit has a very assurance kind of functional view, if you will, but I've seen you operate with a lot of view on innovation within Santander, because that will help all of us here.
Well, I guess there are two elements of the possible answer. One, Santander does not only do retail banking, but retail banking is a very relevant part of our activity. And our view there is that clearly, as in some other industries, we have to simplify our offer. And as a consequence of that, first is simplification, and second is a different operational and technological infrastructure for the simplified business. To put an example, if you are Tesla and you produce hundreds of different models, you have a very complex infrastructure. If you produce 3 or 4 kind of models, that's easier. It's the same for us. If we have 3 basic or 4 basic or 5 basic products, you can manage it in a totally different way from operational and technological point of view, with very relevant consequences in terms of client satisfaction and costs. The other part of it is audit within that transformation, or even before transformation, strategic thinking. Well, we have commented in some previous editions of this summit our view that audit in the design of the processes might be the future, and might be more than the future, a way to even collapse the three lines of defense in one single system of, let's call it, verification. What we're trying to do is be involved from the very beginning in the process through which the technology that will make able that simplified retail business is being developed. So we can identify the processes, the controls needed within the processes, and the elements of control that we need for our audit purpose. So that it's not even that we develop software that can execute automatically the tests using data that have been gathered from the operational systems, and later on, 2 months later, we execute our test. Is that ideally, we should be able of executing tests at the same time as the operations are happening. That may be said by some purists is not audit, it's a different thing. But we can say something that is also opposite to that. That's control. And why cannot you execute control that is second line and third line of defense, different controls at the same time, if you have all the data and you have the tests needed for the second line and for the third line? If you have the data and you have the execution, you can do whatever you want. So the transformation of the retail business in the sense of simplification, different operation, different technology, may have also the consequence of different way of auditing by introducing what we call audit chips in the same execution of the operations.
All right. Thank you for that great inspiration for all of us to think about not just the talent risk, let's leave the room thinking about innovation. And that's the way, that's the answer to kind of, for all of us to reflect on and what we can do to tide through, at least this evening and the dinner, and we'll come back tomorrow for more conversations. So thank you all. And
Thank you. Thank you.